Meeting of the Finance Subcommittee. Could the clerk please call the roll? Here.
Here.
And so a number of items have been referred to the subcommittee over the last several weeks. So we'd like to try to get, see if we can get to all of them, but knowing that there's a full agenda. But if there's no members of the subcommittee, any desire and what we want to go through first? No? Okay. Why don't we go, we do have the city manager and CFO and data analyst, and the chief. Mr. Manager, you have a presentation on the fire department overtime. Would we like to proceed with that?
Yes,
we'll get to the auditor and other issues after.
Okay. So we'll start with the presentation on the overtime then.
Is it on?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. First of all, what we've done is in this first slide sets out overtime usage year to date for all the departments in the city. If you look at the far right-hand column, that gives the percentages of the year-to-date overtime. As you can see, down below, if you go down below to snow and ice, you see that it's 310%. Of course, there's a good reason for that, and that's the terrible winter we had, so that's explainable. If you go up top and count down to the fifth section, that's the fire department. And as of this point in time, the fire department has expended 85.73% of their overtime. And that's with the $347,000 that we transferred from the salary and wages permanent employees. So we track overtime on a regular basis, and we're really concerned with the fire department overtime and the sustainability of it, and that's what got us here today. The next slide shows the use of overtime in all of the departments from fiscal year 15 versus last fiscal year 14. Again, if you go to the far right-hand column, again, down below, you'll see that snow and ice is 210,000 over last year because of the snow. But you can see that the fire department is, as at this point in time, they are 481,796 over last year's overtime usage. The next slide is a historical perspective of the past 3 fiscal years' department's use of overtime for each department. And again, when we came to the fire department, we see that in 13 they had 577,000 in overtime, fiscal 14 454, and now 936 to date. The next slide is really, this just shows that in the city of Lowell, the vast majority of overtime is used by public safety. Obviously, the police and the fire department uses the vast amount of overtime expended by any departments in the city. And then the final slide shows that this is the end of the year budget versus the actuals. And basically, the projections in the fiscal year 15 budget right on line for most departments, but again, we're dealing with the overtime issue in the fire department. Now, that's the presentation. It's one thing to say, here's what the overtime issue is, but I think it's more important to try and explain how we got to this point and where we're going from here to try and address the situation. First of all, there isn't one issue in my mind that led to this uptick in fire department overtime this fiscal year. I think there's a number of issues. First of all, the closing of only one company per shift was not sustainable under this budget. It's interesting from my research, from a historical perspective, we have closed 2 companies per shift more than we've closed one company per shift. So that was a real drain on our budget to just close one company for this most of this fiscal year. The second issue was the fire department's contract calls for when there's a snow emergency, which we had at least 2 snow emergencies declared by the governor in January and February. When there is a snow emergency declared, is that the fire chief under the contract must open every company in the fire department and add a firefighter to every apparatus in the fire department. For the pay period of February, the 4 weeks in February alone, that's when we had the January blizzard and then the February storm where there were 2 snow emergencies, we spent $210,000 in overtime in that short period of time. And that's directly related to the contractual obligation to open up all of the companies and put additional firefighters on each piece of apparatus. And the third thing is there has been an increase in sick time in the fire department, calling for more overtime to fill in the spots. So what are we doing to address this issue? First of all, we are continuing to monitor the closing of companies. Now, you've got to understand, when we say we're closing a company, that doesn't mean we're closing a fire station. There are half of our fire stations, I think half of our fire stations have multiple companies in them. So like the Branch Street Firehouse has 2 companies in it. And so if we close one company, the Branch Street Firehouse is still open, but it has 1 company in it. So you have to differentiate between companies and stations. So we're going to continue to monitor the opening and closing of companies. And maybe we can do a review of it and find out those period of times when it's better, if we're going to close an additional company, during that period of time, it makes more sense to close that. Not in the time of like July and August when there are high vacation periods for firefighters, but another time of the year where it's more sustainable. As far as the snow emergency language in the contract, we're going to start negotiations with all unions. And obviously, this is going to be one of the issues of concern in the negotiations to see if we can renegotiate this language that became very expensive this year because of the snow emergencies. And quite honestly, basically what we're doing in a lot of the departments is we're revisiting our sick leave issues, and we are implementing more serious sick leave reviews. What we're now saying is, just like in the police department, they have a new policy where if anybody gets more than 6 sick leave days, they are called in for counseling session, and they are required to give 2/3 medical documentation to justify those sick leave. If they can't give the 2/3 of the justification, then they will have to give, for any future sick leave, they're going to have to give absolute medical documentation for each sick leave, and if they don't, they're subject to disciplinary proceedings. So this isn't just in the fire department, it's citywide. We're trying to do a more serious review of sick leave. The positive things is as the fire chief has relayed previously, we're hoping by July 1st to add 8 new firefighters to the ranks. And we have applied for a SAFER grant where we have requested grant funding from the state for 12 new additional firefighters. So hopefully by increasing the staffing levels of the fire department, we're going to be able to cut down on overtime. And also, that isn't going to take care of the issue in and of itself, but by monitoring the sick leave, monitoring the closing of companies, we're hopefully going to make the overtime more sustainable in the future. And that's basically the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Manager. Well, I appreciate the fact that we received this information and there's an explanation for some of the causes of the increase, but it really is a dramatic dramatic increase from one year to next. Can I just ask one question before I turn over to the members? So I guess on the third to last slide, year-to-date historical, the FY15 is a projected use of overtime, or is that what is in the budget? Or that's not what we've expended year-to-date? Or is it year-to-date historical?
That is year-to-date historical.
So year-to-date,
13, 14, and 15.
so year-to-date, we're at $936,181, and can you project out if we sustain this over $1 million?
If we went on the current pace, you're looking at $1.24 million.
And that is on what page?
On the last page, it
Oh, it
details
is on
it.
the last page, okay. And at this point, so there was a transfer to cover this, the 300,000 to the budget of 745. So where's the rest of the money? Where's that coming from? If it continues at this pace for the 1.2 million.
That's why we're closing 2 fire companies
Okay.
right now, is that by closing 2 fire companies, we're going to be able to make it through the end of the fiscal year under the current budgeting without going to the 1.2 million.
I see. So, and look, I'll just speak for myself. I know, I'll presume I'm going to speak for my colleagues. Nobody wants to have any companies closing. However, we can't sustain this level of expenditure. How did we, well, first and foremost, and I mean, not only this year, but in future years. So, and it's also good to know that we're not closing stations, that there are more than one companies at the station, and we're not compromising public safety. I mean, that's I know that can be interpreted differently from different individuals, but we will have coverage across the city in the event of the fire. How many companies will be open when there is a closure of 2?
Chief?
There would be 11 companies open. There's 13 companies
Right.
altogether.
Okay. Okay. Where we're moving to get grant funds for 12 new ones in addition to the 8 that are
Yes.
being replaced, or those are additional.
No, there's definitely 8 coming on at the beginning in July, and then we're applying for an additional 12.
Okay. Are you looking into the sick time use and where you have seen the trends? I mean, there's some long-term sick issues, but I mean, that can't account for.
Well, I think most of the increase was extended leave. As I mentioned at the council meeting, these were individuals who became sick or injured off-duty.
Off-duty.
That number was actually about 116% higher than the same time period last fiscal year. How do I explain that? I don't know. On a different given year, these individuals may have gotten hurt on the job or not hurt at all. The good news is that list is already shrinking. I have 2 or 3 people coming back from extended injury leave. I have 1 member who's been cleared by PERAC for retirement. So, I mean, that's what I categorize as kind of an unusual year for that type of sick leave. I think it's already starting to move back into what would be considered the normal range.
Okay. I mean, we do find, I mean, I'm glad you're reviewing the policies, Mr. Manager, because it's not just the fire department. It's citywide that we have to strengthen these policies because it's a significant burden financially when it comes to people going out and having to backfill on overtime or even buy back sick. So I think it's a systemic problem that we need to address as a city on both the city and the school department side. So thank you, Mike. Appreciate my colleagues indulging me. Council Martin, Council Kennedy.
Sure.
Council
Mr. Manager,
Council-
so you said there's 2 companies closed more often than there's 1, or historically that's been the case. How do you decide and who decides?
I've asked the chief that same question. It's a convoluted process, so I'd ask him to address it.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that decision is not made by any measure of what is the best public safety approach. The reality is, we close 1 or 2 stations depending on how much overtime money is available. How much is appropriated, how much is willing to be spent. That's essentially what dictates our closures.
I don't think that's the question. What he's at, remember when I asked you, how do you, when you're going to close a company tonight, how do you decide which company you're closing? You told me you base it upon the personnel, whether they're veterans.
Yeah, okay, there are a lot of factors. I thought Councilor Martin asked, how do you determine whether to close one
One
or
or
two?
two, right.
And the answer is what I stated.
How much money's there?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's it. And I'm not saying that's a good policy, but it's almost like a backwards approach. Instead of determining some level of fire risk that we're willing to accept, or a level of staffing, and funding that, whatever that means, the approach has always been whatever money is available in overtime.
But someone has to decide that, right? Someone has to look at the budget. Is that you?
Well,
or is that a deputy under you?
It's actually you when you approve the budget, or if monies get cut from a budget, or when the final budget ends up for approval, that's what the figure is.
I mean, I'm trying to get back to historically. I mean, I thought, part of the reason for the 24-hour shift was going to be, less usage of sick time, less usage of overtime, yet it doesn't seem to have worked, at least based on the last 3 years that we have in front of us. It seems to be ever increasing.
Yeah. Don't forget that the 24-hour shift is essentially a 10-hour day shift and a 14-hour night shift worked back to back.
Right.
So members can use sick leave for the day shift and come in at night, vice versa, same thing with vacation. So the 24 hours doesn't mean if somebody is out sick that they're out sick for 24 hours.
No, but it has. Do you think that's achieved any savings in the budget by going to that shift?
I think through all fire departments that changed to the 24-hour schedule, I think initially there is a reduction in overall sick leave use, and that probably levels off or gets close to where it was before the shift. I mean, I'd have to really look at the numbers. We've been on the 24-hour shift for...
Close to 10 years, right?
I think it's longer, yeah. Yeah.
So, and then the increase in sick time this year, when you said it's 116% above, what does that translate to in people? Like how many?
For this fiscal year, I'm looking at seven or eight people who were on what we would term extended sick leave or long-term sick leave versus 4 individuals from the previous fiscal year.
Okay, all right. That's all I have for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Council Martin. Council Kennedy?
Mr. Chairman. Actually, I filed a motion for tomorrow night asking for a report from the fire department on the overtime for the past 5 years, and to justify why the overtime has gone up over 5 years, because it seems to me that if we're going to talk about the increase in overtime, that there should at least be an opportunity to look at whether or not those increases have been justified. So I'll just let some of that go for tomorrow evening. But there's 2 things that I would like to ask about. And one is that in your presentation, Mr. Manager, you mentioned that the contract as it exists now requires the city to have a full complement whenever there's a snow emergency. And so, Chief, do you know, could you estimate how long that's been in the contract? And also, that sounds like, is that something that, was that a city initiative, or was that a union initiative, or why is that in the contract, I guess, is my second question.
Well, to answer your first question, I would say it's been in the contract for about 2 or 3 years, maybe slightly longer.
Okay.
Whether that ended up in the contract from the city side or the union side, I don't know the answer to that. I was not involved in the negotiation.
Okay.
And just so you understand, what it calls for is to not only keep every fire company open, but to hire an additional, a fourth person on each company.
Okay, so every time there's a snowstorm, then we have to load up. We're
It's
loading up.
actually a declared state of emergency, right?
Okay.
Either by the governor or the mayor of the city, and then we do have to load up, right?
Okay. And so how many times did that occur this winter?
Well, this winter was kind of odd. It was almost like a sustained state of emergency. Now, I will add in there, too, that the union does work with the manager, and they actually called off that hiring practice several days into it. So we didn't have to do it for the entire length of the state of emergency. But the very first snowstorm we were hit with, the last week of January, we spent $90,000 in overtime, 1 week. That was 12% of my allotted budget in 1 week because of that
Right.
clause, right?
Okay, but again, during this past winter, do you know how many times, how many instances we had to load up with personnel, or for how many days we did that?
Well, I would say the first one was probably 2 or 3 days, maybe 4 or 5 shifts. I would have to look, and I mean, I could get that information. I don't have it right now.
Okay.
But, so once the state of emergency is declared, we open all the companies, we hire the extra shift, and that carries from shift to shift until the end of the state of emergency, or until the manager and the union get together and determine that they won't do it any longer.
Okay, so what triggers that is when the governor declares a state of emergency?
Correct,
Okay.
yes.
So it's my understanding that over this past winter, there was one storm that we're able to recoup money for. And then the second storm, we weren't eligible for money, at least so far. Now, is that still a state of emergency? Does anybody know the answer to that?
That was the difficult one, was first of all, the state of emergency for the January blizzard. That's what we're applying for. But the real problem came in with the February storm, is remember the governor declared a state of emergency for like 3 counties, and he kept it open-ended for days. And finally, I was able to talk to the union, and they were gracious to say that even though the governor hadn't stopped it, that we would stop that policy of adding all of the companies and all of the additional firefighters. The good news is I talked to Congresswoman Tsongas, and they are lobbying right now with FEMA to cover the February storm also. So hopefully we can recoup some of those costs down the road.
Okay. So if you're working with the bargaining unit over ending the state of emergency, then that implies, I think, that it was the bargaining unit that wanted that put into the contract. I mean, I know you weren't here, so you wouldn't necessarily know, but, and you're not involved in negotiations with the,
No, under the previous administration, I was not.
okay. Okay, then let's, let me just go on from that to the sick time. It sounds like from the answers that you gave to Councilor Martin, that part of the situation that we have here is that the sick time and the sick time budget is driving policy in the fire department. In other words, fire safety and how the manning is done is driven to a large extent by the amount of money that we have for sick time or for overtime, I guess. Is that a fair statement?
Well, for overtime, yeah.
Yeah.
I would remind you that it's not that every time somebody calls in sick, they're replaced at time and a half. Some of the groups may have 40, 41 men assigned to that group. If there's 40 men, that means that 4 can be out before we even look to hire, and that's if we're only closing 1 company. If we're closing 2 companies, 7 people could actually be out on sick leave or vacation that tour before we begin to hire. So it's not sick leave equals time and a half of overtime.
Okay.
And earlier, my point was not sick leave cost. It was money available for overtime. That's what drives whether we close one company or two companies, for how long. It's what's available to do the hiring. Essentially, keeping companies open has a cost to it. It's a hefty cost. I've calculated it out that the difference spending overtime money to keep one extra company open for an entire year is over $1 million in overtime. So that's the reality. Keeping companies open costs money. The alternative is to beef up the fire department staffing or some combination of staffing and overtime. But my point was that the number of company closings is driven largely by what overtime money is available. Yes, sick leave does play into that. I won't dispute that.
But it's overtime.
But it's overtime money available,
Okay.
yes.
But you would also agree, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you would agree that that's not really sound, is it, for the overtime budget to be driving the fire safety policies of the department?
I agree with that 100%. I think it's more or less a backdoor approach. It shouldn't be whatever money is available or willing to be spent that dictates fire safety coverage in the city. I would like to see us determine some level of safety coverage, staffing that's agreeable to all parties, and then fund that, whatever that means.
Okay. And just to go back, before 3 years ago, or when the last administration was here, prior to that, we didn't have that additional manning when there was a state of emergency. Is that
No,
right?
we didn't have that clause that made it automatic. Certainly, we would staff up. If we had 3 feet of snow out there, if we're shoveling hydrants, if it's going to be difficult for access, we would hire extra people. We wouldn't necessarily hire an extra man per shift.
Right.
We would certainly keep all the companies open.
Right.
And then we would determine when we didn't need to keep all the companies open or the extra men.
But that,
So-
right, so that was more of a common sense approach rather than just contractual with the
Yes,
bargaining?
yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks.
Thank you, Council Kenny. Councilor Samaras.
Thank you, Mayor Elliott. Question, I understand, the problems that you have running a department like this and being concerned with the safety of our citizens. And I understand that the budget is will drive your choices. But I believe the question that Councilor Martin asked, and I'm curious about, is who makes the decision, whose title is responsible for making decisions as to whether fire stations should be closed or how many and where? And the follow-up question, do they have the power based on if the budget would dictate a serious cut, can they say, no, we just can't take the cut? I have to ensure the safety of Pawtuckaville or, certain parts of the city. In other words, what decision-making do they have? I know that you're talking about the budget making one means of how you choose, but I'm asking you, how do you do it as administrators to assure that the city's safe? It's
Okay,
difficult.
to determine which companies will be closed during any shift, the deputy chief downtown here at the Civic Center sets the manpower for the day in the morning for the day shift and at 4 o'clock for the evening shift. And he has a number of factors to look into: who's coming in where in the city, who's capable of operating the apparatus, where the fire officers are, frankly, the experience level of certain crews. And so he'll move personnel around and determine which companies are opened or closed for the shift. The determination as to how many, that's already set. That comes from me, from the city manager, depending on the financial situation. At this time, we're closing one company every shift. At this time, we're closing 2 companies every shift.
But can the deputy challenge that request by stating that at this point, for whatever reason, for whatever's going on, that we have to add additional firefighters to the budget?
Well, I guess the answer would be yes on a per-shift basis. If there was something happening, the deputies always have the latitude to staff up. But the issue then becomes, as the overtime budget dwindles, then what do? Do we transfer money? Do we not transfer money and run with whoever comes in? And that may mean closing 5 companies per shift. We don't want to do that. It's better, as much as I don't like closing fire companies, it's better to kind of modulate and close 2 as you go along than to just close the 1 or none and then get to a point where there's no more overtime money, there's no money to be transferred, and now we're closing 4 or 5 per shift.
No, you explained that well, and I understand that. I just want to be assured that in the case, there is latitude or room to make a decision for safety at some point, if a deputy or yourself feel that that's necessary at that point in time. You follow what I'm saying?
If I'm following you, yes, at that point in time.
Yeah.
Certainly, they don't.
I'm not
have
talking about affecting the overall overtime budget, but at a point in time, do we have people that can make a decision regarding the safety of the citizen in the city?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Like, I mean, for example, if we're in a period where we're closing 2 fire companies, the deputies don't have the latitude to say, I'm closing 1. But if there's something going on, 2 bridges closed, and then certainly on a shift by shift basis, then they do have that latitude.
That's the example I wanted. Thank
Okay,
you.
then the answer is yes.
Thank you, Council. Further questions from members of the council? Chief, so I guess around 90,000 can be attributed to the storm, the first storm, right?
210,000. The 4 weeks were all contributed to the storm. Those condensed 4 weeks in end of January to the end of February.
Okay, what did those 7 or 8, so what is the policy right now in the fire department if someone's going off on long-term? Do they, not long-term, or they're out sick? You said you have 7 or 8 of them. What do? Do they have to check in? They just say that they're out for whatever?
They have to keep their doctor's notes current. So they have an appointment and the doctor says they'll be seen again in 6 weeks. We're expecting a note to be brought in that says they'll be seen on this date and then on that date. They're always kept current. We do track what's going on.
All right. So do they check in with the occupational therapist or our occupational nurse in the law department? Because that's the process for workers' comp. I mean, that's how, it was, you weren't the chief at the time, but a number of years ago, we had a very huge number of individuals on 111F. And we understand firefighters and police officers are going to get hurt. But there was some abuse as well, and that number has come right down by virtue of changing the process where our doctors, the city doctors, are talking directly to the individual's doctors. So is that happening now, or is it just your office reviews whatever the doctor's notes and they just continue to stay on sick leave?
You're exactly right for individuals who are injured on the job.
Right.
They're closely tracked. That's the 111F.
Right.
What we're talking about is individuals who are injured off-duty.
Oh, no, I understand that.
Yeah, so the tracking is not the same. The city doctor does not get involved. If the individual is out for an extended period of time, they're encouraged to file for family medical leave. That allows the city to track them more closely.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a different dynamic when they're out on sick leave versus injury leave.
And what is the cost of that overtime this particular year, if that is one of the contributing factors for those 7 or 8?
That really hasn't been broken out. That would be kind of difficult to do. Like I've said before, too, the overtime is not just a pile of money to keep companies open. It's the same overtime that we use on a general alarm fire when we have to call everybody back. A piece of equipment breaks down and I have to call in the mechanic. This past couple of weeks, the dive team was activated twice for the Merrimack River.
Right.
That all gets paid out of that overtime money, and it's not really broken down as far as, the replacement cost of any one of these individuals or collectively.
It's got to be coded by sick time. I mean, if somebody's sick, it's got to be charged sick time versus just overtime that you're calling somebody in. I understand it's charged to the overtime account. I'm just trying to find out the number of days and number of individuals and how much that is.
Well, you're exactly right. It is coded sick leave. I guess what I'm saying is that 2 people call in sick tonight, and it doesn't require us to hire any overtime. Tomorrow night, one person calls in sick, and because of staffing, we have to hire. I don't have that information as far as which sick leaves actually required overtime or how much.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. Okay. The other thing is my understanding that the police fire, i.e. Larimore system, does not interface with the Munis system. That, to me, seems like something that we should be looking at. What, especially in this day and age, why aren't those two systems talking to each other, and shouldn't they be?
Absolutely. And as far as the city goes, the official book of record is Munis. So what's in Larimore, sometimes when someone retires and they have accruals that we need to pay out, they'll send a Larimore report over. It doesn't necessarily tie to Munis. We have to go with Munis unless they can find what the error was, and maybe there was an error. Because what we found is sometimes they'll adjust something in Larimore saying, oh, that guy was marked down for sick, but it wasn't actually sick, it was vacation. They'll go adjust in Larimore, but if it doesn't get turned into the auditor's office to adjust, then they're not going to be compatible anymore. My understanding is the reason they have the Larimore system is for the scheduling aspect. I know I've talked with Moran about the employee self-service module that we're starting to get more involved with, that at some point that would have the capabilities to be able to do the scheduling. You can take time, you can request time off, you can see everyone under you, what their schedules look like. So they might be able to get to a point where they can use the ESS only and get rid of Larimore. I think a lot of us would be happy with that. I don't know about the fire and police, but it's definitely a concern for sure that they don't match. And that's why, as far as, when someone leaves and we're doing a file payout, we go by what Munis says, because that's the official book of record. So if Larimore is off, we have to, reconcile it.
So maybe we can just take that up at the next, during your discussion, but how do we get those two systems to talk to each other? So there is no, so there is no lapse, or there's no confusion, misinformation.
Yeah, as far as I know of, there's no, kind of automatic programming that could happen to import it from one to the other. That probably have to be custom programming. But I do know, since we just, actually I'm not sure if it's on here or not, but we just implemented the daily accruals in Munis, which will help a lot, because now if Larimore says Larimore tracks it by day. So if someone calls in sick on a day, it has the actual day. Munis used to only do it by week, which was the pay period. Now we implemented, and it went live. We tested it. It went great. It went live last month, to where when they take a sick day, they actually put in what day it was. So we can now run reports out of Munis that'll show you by day. So if they're off, it'll be easier going forward to reconcile that, because you'll be able to see, compare the 2 days as opposed to a day and a week.
Okay.
If I might, Mr. Chairman, and I don't want to speak for the auditor, but I think until fairly recently, did Munis not have the capability to, tick off accruals until the day was actually taken? See, we need the ability to take from accruals when somebody schedules out ahead of time, so that if they put in for something, we need to know, well, you don't have those days because you have 2 weeks already scheduled 6 months down the road. I'm not sure Munis.
It has the capability in the ESS system. It hasn't been implemented yet.
Okay.
So that's one of those, eventually,
Right.
people can go in, put their, I wish Moran was here. People can go in and put in their time off requests in Munis. It'll be workflowed to their supervisor. And at that point, once it's approved, it actually reserves those accruals, so they can't use it for other things.
Right.
Eventually get to there, there's a lot of work involved in implementing it.
Yep. And the other thing is, we use Larimore to report to the state. All our fire reporting under the Mass Fire Incident Reporting System is done electronically through Larimore. That's our scheduling, our fire reporting system. So I don't know that we could ever get rid of it. We could certainly migrate our scheduling, I guess, over to Munis.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking that there's got to be a module that the fire department will be able to use for the financial aspect of it to ensure that whatever information is being entered on both police and fire is, migrates right over to the Munis system especially. And you did answer my question. That's the data that we send down to the state, so. Okay, well, I think you've answered a lot of the questions we have. You can understand it's a staggering increase, Chief, knowing where we were last year. Certainly almost 3 times the amount of overtime if we continued down this path. So we have to take a look at it and make some adjustments. And knowing again, budgets are always tight, but this year, like many other years, it's going to be a challenging year. We want to keep open as many stations as we can, but balance so many other aspects. It would be nice to see. Council Kennedy has a report tomorrow night, so maybe I'll wait to speak on that, considering we spoke on this. But just the number of individuals. I happen to agree with Councilor Martin. We did go to I remember, and I voted for the 24-hour shift, and one of the driving factors was to reduce the sick time because we saw an escalation of overtime, and we did see it level out. In fact, it even dropped slightly from FY13 to 14. Is there, in your opinion, is the 24-hour shift, is it still something that the city should look at, knowing that was one of the factors was to reduce the sick time?
Well, all I can say to that is there are more fire departments moving toward the 24-hour shift than away from it. And I also think the experience has been that initially it did lower sick leave instances, but I also think the experience is that after some point that has leveled off. Would it make sense to look at going back to the old schedule? I don't really think that would change anything as far as sick leave use.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you. There were no motions. Thank you for the information. Anything else, Mr. Manager? No, Rodney? It would be good to see, the sick time use and the overtime use over a period of time. Could we look for tomorrow night, look into when we adopted the 24-hour schedule for discussion tomorrow night? I think it is over 10 years. That would be helpful.
Okay, yeah, we'll take a look at it.
That was in 2001 that we adopted the 24-hour schedule.
2001? Okay.
Yeah, I believe it was February.
I do see the president here. Anything for the union? Okay. Yeah, you've attended the meeting. Any thoughts?
I'd be happy to answer what I can. Obviously, I didn't necessarily come prepared with
No. I'm just you're kind enough to come, so I just wanted to.
I could answer out of some of the questions. Please feel free to ask.
Okay. I think the chief did. Councilor Kennedy?
Let me ask you, because maybe you were here when it was done, but what is the reason for the additional manning during a state of emergency? Why do we have that?
Well, typically during a state of emergency, this actually began back many years ago when we had the floods. Quite literally the day after the floods, we closed the company in that exact area. So that prompted discussion. There was a lot of discussion within the local, how do we try and fix this? How do we keep our own guys, men and women, along with the citizens of the city safe? So a lot of factors go into when we talk about these things, and not having bodies, not having boots on the ground is what did that. During the floods, we had, for instance, a rescue company that's based down here, had their raft in the middle of the street, but in the middle of the water down by Wood Street. So a lot of these things factor in because without that additional manpower, you're not able to do that. You're not able to respond to half of I shouldn't say half, a number of the emergencies that occur during these states of emergency. There's somebody going every which way. So there's companies from the Highlands that might be, in Belvedere at any given time because of the number of calls. The volume of calls during a state of emergency come in, they're harder to respond to. On Engine 2, I responded to a call during the snow emergency on Walker Place. Now, if anybody's familiar with Walker Place, it's probably the length of this building, maybe a little bit further. Had not been touched by shovel or plow. So it happened to be, when I was there, it was an odor of gas. It was early in the snowstorm, so again, it's natural. Everybody was working, DPW was working hard, we all were. But we had to trudge through 4 feet of snow just to get in there. Now, keep in mind, if there's a heart attack that somebody is having at that time, we have to get to that person and extricate that person. The other thing that we do during those, like the high wind type states of emergency, or as time wears on, if you have an ice storm or something and there's wires down, where normally, because there's a hazard, you would take an entire fire company. So again, working out of Branch Street myself, if there's something going on Walker Street, without that, you would take the entire truck, Engine 2, and we would sit on that problem. What we're able to do by having the extra manning in that particular instance is, and it's something the chief has implemented, is you take that one individual that's the additional hire and you say, okay, take a fire car, basically you can put your flashes on, put out some cones and make sure that nobody gets hurt by that down power line. So where you would normally be, now you're down another company because without that Engine 2 sitting at Walker Street, I can't leave a power line if there's a structure fire 2 streets over. So a lot of it is not just firefighter safety because again, in these situations, there's a high volume of calls. So we're all running all over the place. Anybody who's been through a couple of these storms knows, very rarely do you spend a lot of time in your own neighborhood, just by virtue of that. So
I'm not so much interested in discussing the merits of whether it's a good idea or not. What my question was really, when it was during the last contract, which I'm assuming is when this was negotiated.
Two contracts ago. Yes.
Was it an initiative from the union or from the administration?
It was initiated through the local, but it was collectively bargained. I mean,
I understand
we
that.
couldn't get it without the city saying, okay.
Right.
A prior
Okay.
administration.
But it was the union that wanted it put into the contract?
Correct.
Okay. That's all I had.
Oh,
Thanks.
okay. Thank you. Anything else? Like I said, more than happy to answer anybody's question on this.
Thank you, Mrs. Keane, for coming to the meeting. Mr. Poitras? No. Anything else? I guess we'll just accept the report as a report of progress, and we'll...
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll present. Council Martin?
No, I'm all set. Thanks.
So, thank you, Chief. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Manager. Staying for the rest? Staying for the rest? So, why don't we go with the next item we have on the agenda is FY. We had motion to refer this FY14 independent audit, city audit. So why don't we go, if there's no questions, we'll go right to Madam Auditor.
Yeah, and when I had put this on back in February, there was a brief summary on top of it, so I can go through that first, and if you guys have any more specific questions, we can flip through. Overall, and even in the end of the audit interview, basically, that I sat down with the outside auditors, they said, their overall view of the city is that we're in a really good position. Yet, it looks like the net position of the city is going down, but a lot of that is understandable. A good portion of that was the OPEB. We had an overall, back up a little bit. The statements that we're talking about here that are the audited statements, they're a different kind of accounting than the state reporting that we do. And so they're looking at accrual basis. There's a lot of other things they take into account that we don't take into account for like the free cash calculation. Overall, we had a $26.6 million decrease in the net position, which is the equivalent of fund balance on this, basis of accounting. $8.6 million of that was the money that you guys decided to set aside for the OPEB, in the OPEB trust and stabilization funds. So that's a good thing. We took $8.6 million and set it aside. But as far as these financial statements go, that pulls that money out of the financial statement. So it looks like a reduction. but it's not, I mean, it's definitely a positive reduction. Another part of that was 12.1 million was due to the increase in the actuarial estimate of the OPEB liability. You know, unfortunately, that's not something we can really control. We can look at what some of the metrics are that they're using as far as the percentage of increase in the health costs, how many people are going to be on the health plans. Those are things that definitely when they're going through the process of getting that estimate, we can try and, you know, have the actuaries adjust, because they do make a huge difference. If they lower a percent or raise a percent, it can make a big swing in that liability number. But that's something that all entities out there are dealing with. I have never heard of someone whose OPEB liability went down. They're all increasing. So as far as like the bond raters go, they all understand that. They really, that's not their biggest concern. And then the delayed in the financing of the capital projects was also a factor. But once again, I actually put in a note to the financial statements in the statements, which when the bond raters look at it, we'll see it. That showed, it was note 15 to the notes to the financial statement, that showed, you know, that we issued that debt fairly quickly after we closed the books. So that was a temporary reduction, basically. The enterprise funds actually increased their net position by 3.3 million. And most of this is summarized also in the, it's the management's discussion of analysis, which if you flip open, it starts on page 4 of the financial statements, and it goes into a lot more detail of what all is happening. But like I said, they said the city is in a good position. They're very happy with the way things are going. They were actually very impressed with the change in the management structure. You know, we had 4 new people coming on that are that they all thought was very positive change that were happening with the new manager, the city treasurer, the CFO. I mean, they've been happy with all the changes we've made so far. If you go to the management letter, I was just going to point out a few things on there. With the exception of the fixed assets, everything that they have on these comments is either in work or has already been completed. The fixed asset one that they've actually had for many years on here, they want us to get a fixed asset system that tracks the fixed asset. The problem with that is number one, you have to purchase that system. 2, you have to have a person who basically that's their job, is to input all the assets as they're coming and going. As you can imagine, the city has a lot of assets, both large and small, which would be highly complex. It would probably be a full-time position. So that's one of the items that really, for many years, no action has been taken on that one. But outside of that particular item, everything else is either in process or has already been corrected. Any questions on the statements?
Council Martin?
So, yeah, let me start there. So I actually thought that was pretty good, that the management letter only had 4 issues, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And they're very minor issues.
So that one, I understand it's been there many years, and I agree that there's maybe not a lot of bang for the buck to solve that one. But the other one where it said no action taken in 14, certain bank accounts not reconciled each month, the very first comment.
Yeah, and that is in process. The new city treasurer, that's one of the big goals that she's been working on, and she has been working on it because I know this because she's come and asked me some questions regarding certain things. She is working on that one. She is working on, the 4th one, if you flip to page 5, that says the accounts not maintained by treasurer and account signers. Most of that was really old stuff that had no action on it. They've already closed, I think she was given a list by the auditors of 3, and they've already closed 2 of the 3, and they're working on getting the other one closed. And then same thing with the old outstanding receivables, that's another project she's working on.
So the receivables, does that mean unpaid taxes, or?
In fact, what she found out when she started looking into it was that we have, what's the company that does our tax billing for us? The one. Sorry. Well, anyway, we have them.
Bill Trust.
Yeah.
Bill?
So they send out the bills, they're the collector, the one that's
Oh, no.
collects.
Bill Trust is the company that actually prints the bills and sends out
Right.
the tax bills. We've retained a company out of TaxServe that's pursuing outstanding
Right.
personal property taxes dating back to 1992.
Right, and so what she's found is that some of these items that they are saying that we should write off were written off in that company's records, but not on our general ledger. So those are things that she and I are working together to reconcile. Okay, which ones have they already written off? And if so, we need to get that corrected in Munis. That's something she recently started working on and will continue. So hopefully we'll have that finished by the end of this fiscal year.
Okay. So I know the last auditor had given us sort of a graph periodically tracking the outstanding items, and I was going to ask you to do that, but I don't think we need it. I mean, I can keep track of 4 items, so as long as we keep the list down, I think
And,
that's
we're
pretty
trying
good.
to dwindle it from year to year. They're always going to find something, and that's what I was trying to, I was explaining to someone else that they're always going to find something, or else you're going to think they're not doing their job.
Right.
These particular items they found are all very insignificant in the grand scheme of, what it could be. So, like I said, when they walked me through these, they said the same thing, and they said, we think the city is in a great place, things are being managed really well. All the feedback was very positive.
Yep. No, I agree. I don't really have issues with the management letter. On your memo that you gave us, so I understand the increased OPEB liability goes up, so that reduces our fund balance. Yet when we reserve money for that doesn't count. That also reduces the fund balance. I mean, it just doesn't.
Right. So the interesting thing, so this is GAAP, right? So what happens is on the government-wide statements, and that's where that 26.6 million decrease is, that government-wide statements only take certain funds into account. Okay, the stabilization funds are not included in those statements. So when we moved money out of general fund or the general stabilization fund, which is included in there, when we move it from here to here, it comes off that statement completely. So it looks like a reduction, but it's not.
All right, thanks.
Councilor Kennedy? So I appreciate the work that you did, Madam Auditor, because I know you only came here, it seems longer, but July. Was it July that you?
June 7th,
June.
I believe.
So you had to close and open at the same time and then work with the auditors. So I appreciate all the effort, and I know we spoke a little bit during that time, but what I do like is I like the fact you're going out to bid for audit services contract. When does that expire?
So we've already received the
Gone out.
bids, and we're in process of interviewing.
Oh, you are? Okay, great. I do think it's healthy, quite frankly, to go out and solicit. I know there are somewhat limited financial institutions that do this, but I think that's good. And I think Council Martin asked most of the question I did. Most of the still outstanding of the prior year comments still unresolved, just in the treasurer's office, essentially. I was concerned as well with the unauthorized accounts that you've closed some of them, but clearly the current treasurer is on it, and those she's going to make sure she's the authorized signer on those accounts. The ones that you closed, what was the dollar figures in those accounts? Any idea?
I'd have to ask her, but I thought when we talked about it, she said they were basically old accounts that didn't have anything in them. They were
Right.
just sitting out there that needed to be closed.
Okay,
So they just have to go through the paperwork with the bank and,
Right.
to be able to close it out.
okay, great. And again, the comment about reconciling, individual fund reconciliations, it's good to know she's got to go back and do 14, and then of course just try to stay current. And is that going well to the best of your knowledge?
Yeah, so I worked with them to help to reconcile it through 14, and then she's working forward from there. But yes, she's picking up on, quite a few things. She's working on, the problem was, and even going back to 14, we were reconciling that as a whole, not by fund. There were some funds that had their own bank accounts, but most of them are on pooled cash. So it gets a little convoluted when you have pooled cash to reconcile by fund. So she's working on doing that going forward from 14.
I don't think we have any other, I'm sorry, Council Mercy, Council Milonazo, Council Samaras. No? Okay. I guess we'll bring that forward. Motion to bring both the fire overtime and the audit discussion forward as a report of progress. And motion by Council Martin, second by Council Kennedy. All those in favor signify by saying aye, and the opposed. Motion carries. We also had, what was it, Council Martin, FY15?
I think you touched on that a little bit, the report on progress.
I think that was also
FY15.
referred. FY15, any, outside the overtime, anything else that we need to,
You know, as
Keep
far
an eye
as, and I'm actually about to get you guys your next year-to-date budget report updated. I was hoping to have it on the last one. We had some items come up that I had to deal with right away. So it should be on your next council packet for next week. It's looking really good. There's a few revenues that were behind, but what we're finding was some of them were just put to the wrong place, so we're removing them. But overall, our revenues tracking and our expenditures are tracking. Outside of the snow and ice and the this overtime issue, I don't see any other major issues at this point.
okay. We all set, members of the council? I think those are the only items that were referred to this subcommittee. Thank you, Mr. Manager, and your staff.
Move we adjourn, Mr. Chairman.
Motion to adjourn by Council Kennedy, seconded by Council Martin. All those in favor signify by saying aye, and the opposed, motion carries. This meeting stands adjourned.
You know what we used to call the in our office in Texas, what we called the